Part 26 and Chapter 16. I sat up and Jonathan pulled the blanket up with me, keeping it around me. I smiled and nodded to him, and he shook his head but grinned back. I need to find a better way to do this so I don't keep ruining my clothes, I chuckled. He nodded. You do seem to go through them a lot. I looked around and then went to stand. My legs were a little wobbly, and Jonathan had me in his arms. Okay, kinda like this part. I looked up at him and he smiled. Then my dad cleared his throat. Hey, was it my fault that my wolf blood told me I had a mate, and that this was a bit more physical than my reserved vampire side? A maid held a stack of clothes, and I reached a bare arm out and took them, thanking her. Jonathan helped me to the bedroom and then turned, facing the door, as I sat on the bed and dressed. I watched him as I did, not embarrassed. His shoulders were broad, and he had a nice backside, I realized, smiling as I pulled my shirt over my head. Okay, it's safe, I chuckled, and he turned. When he stepped up to me, he pushed the hair out of my face. This is something I normally couldn't do until we were union, he stated, and I shrugged. Well then, maybe next time you should wait outside. He smiled. If you want me to. Well, that wasn't very fair. Having him this close was hard enough. I felt my heartbeat speed up. In my vampire body it was very slow, but it was still beating harder with him there. I wanted to reach out and touch him. I wanted to feel his hair, inhale his scent, and taste his skin. I shook my head. Guess I kept more of my wolf this time than I thought. What's wrong? With the promise of being honest with each other, I told him, in a more reserved way. He smiled. I see. We might have to rush through this dating period if it gets any harder for you. When my eyes widened, he shrugged, his eyes sparkling. I can't have you doing something that you'll feel bad for later, or that your dad would take out on me. The last part made me flinch. If Jonathan overstepped his rights, my dad would call it off, or worse. Reputation amongst the higher-ranking vampires was a bit over the top, but it was embedded in me too. Jonathan had already seen me without clothes on, though it was while my body was mutating, so I'm not sure that counted. He had held me when I slept, but that didn't count either since I had just shifted, and he was just making sure I was safe. So, there was a fine line with us, as it was. I was going to have to keep my wolf in check. He leaned down and kissed me. I was glad this part wasn't breaking any rules. I liked it far too much to give it up. Finally, he smiled at me. I wonder how fast your dad would allow us to go. I chuckled. Yeah, there were rules for that too. I never paid much attention to them, even though I knew them. A male and female vampire had steps they had to go through. Talking to the parents was the first one. My eyes widened. Your dad? It was the male's duty to speak to his own parents or parent first, and then to the female's. But after he got her parents' consent, she was supposed to have a formal visit with the male's parent. Jonathan shook his head. Don't worry, my dad understands. He's ready whenever you are. Your dad, my dad, and I all talked about it. With what's happening to you, we all agree that some rules will have to be bent. I let out my breath. Good. Vampires were a bit of rule junkies. While the male's parents could try to call things off, they really had enough pull to do it. The female's parents, well, they had a lot of pull, regardless of rank. So complicated. He took my hand. Ready? I nodded. He gave me another quick kiss, and we walked out into the main room. My dad and Trax stood up, and we walked over to them. So when do I meet this maintenance guy? I asked. "When you are ready," my dad stated. I shrugged. "Let's get this over with. I have a party to plan." Jonathan laughed, my dad smiled, and Trax stood quietly. I shot him a look and he shrugged. "I don't like this," he stated, and I balked. "I thought you said I should have the party," the hurt heavy in my voice. He rolled his eyes. "I meant you meeting this guy." "Oh," I grinned, and he chuckled then. Jonathan looked at me. "Are you tired? You can wait." "No, I want to get this over with." Jonathan looked at my dad, and my dad turned to one of his guards, who lifted a small phone and spoke into it. "So, what do I tell this guy?" "The truth, without giving him too much information," my dad explained. I nodded, and we all waited. Finally, the guard's phone beeped, and he put it to his ear. "They're here." My dad turned. "Everyone will clear out except Reina." "What?" Jonathan and Track roared at the same time. "It's the only way. If anyone else is in here, he'll think she's being coerced." "But then she's in here alone," Jonathan snapped. "Yes, in this chamber, with only one way out and cameras everywhere." "Everywhere?" I moaned, thinking about the kiss in my room. My dad nodded, and I bit my lower lip. Trax shook his head. "What about letting me stay? I can't be seen as a real threat." I laughed then. I had seen him hunt full-grown bucks, but I swallowed my laugh when he shot me a look. "If there are cameras everywhere, then how's he going to see that as me speaking freely?" I asked. Finally, it was decided. Jonathan would stay with me. Paige had to be woken up. I felt bad for that, but she only smiled and hugged me, telling me to be safe. The door opened and they all stepped out. Michael paused at the door, looking at me. "I will be watching," he stated, and I smiled. Then another guy stepped in. I was surprised he looked to be about Jonathan's age and smelled the same age too. My dad was behind him. "Reina, this is Lucas," he stated, and with that he turned and left. Lucas had blonde hair that was long and straight. He had it tied at the nape of his neck. His hazel eyes were wide, and he smelled like fear, panic, and a hint of excitement. I had to hold down my wolf instincts that were still very strong this shift. He was not prey. Jonathan stood to the side and behind my right shoulder. He was about an inch taller than Lucas, and broader as well. I smiled. The wolf pride at having a strong mate rose up, and I felt myself stand taller as well. Lucas looked me over, checking for injuries or signs of torture, I guess. Then he looked at Jonathan. "I am staying," he said in a hard tone. Lucas nodded. "It figures." I felt my lip twitch, but Jonathan stepped back. "Why don't you two have a seat?" I turned and walked over to the couch, plopping down on it harder than I meant to. Jonathan surprised me by walking behind the screen into Michael's control room. Lucas sat in a chair near me, and he leaned over, whispering, "We can help you get out of here." I smiled and leaned closer to him. "Really?" He nodded several times. "Yes, we know that they are forcing you to stay here, and they are..." He looked around the room as if something might jump out at him. "Doing things to you." "What kinds of things?" I whispered back, and he balked. "You don't have to pretend with me," he stated, raising his voice a little. "Your father has promised me safe passage out. My friends know I am found out, and Mr. Beldrin has spoken with them on the phone. If I don't return, they will know why." "So, aren't you worried what I could do to you?" He frowned, and I shrugged. "My shifting is still very unpredictable, and..." Okay, so maybe that wasn't the way to go here. I sighed, and he noticed. "You breathe?" he gasped. When I shift, I keep parts of my other form. It changes each time, I explained. Is that because of the drugs? What drugs? The ones they use to keep you calm. I've seen all the needles. And have you seen what's in them? Do you have a medical or science degree? I asked in a heated tone. Well, no. Look, Lucas, my dad loves me very much. He isn't locking me in here to do bizarre experiments on me. I'm here so I can safely maneuver through this. I have doctors here and friends. My dad has brought in experts on hybrid shifting and even a physical therapist to help me. He's not keeping me a prisoner. He's keeping me safe from groups that do want to hurt me. We don't want to hurt you, he snapped. Maybe you don't, but there are those that do. You see, they want my blood, in vials or veins, though I think they would prefer it in veins. They think I hold some magic key to sunwalking, real eternal life, or a dozen other whacked out things. Maybe that's just what they're telling you to keep you here, he tried, but his voice had dipped a bit. I crossed my legs up on the couch in front of me, trying to look as casual as possible. He noticed. Good. Think about it, Lucas. What's more far-fetched? That my own dad, one that is known for being very protective over his little girl, is torturing me and holding me captive in my own home, or that vampires, wares, and other non-humans have heard the rumors and want a piece of me. A hybrid shifting, and one that changes with each shift. They're drooling over that. Doesn't matter that in any form I'm still light sensitive. All they hear is money clacking in large bags, and their own delusions whispering that they could be the one to market me, or whatever they think is in me. I watched his face. He was listening. You know, those kind tell me which would be more likely to lock me up and torture me for what's happening to me, my daddy or those vultures? I sat back, resting my hand on the back of the couch. I was good. Oh, yeah, I was good. Lucas frowned as he thought through my words. Then he looked around. But look at where they have you. I chuckled. I'm in here because of you. Me? I nodded. Yes, you. I was quite comfortable in my suite of rooms, swimming in my pool, playing in the game room, complete freedom, until a mysterious note appeared in my pocket. Oh, he sighed, and I shrugged. So they were worried about my safety. My dad had this place made because someone with his power and rank always has people after him, trying to spread lies or willing to hurt me to get to him. I paused for a long moment and then stood. I've lived a sheltered life, that's true, but no more than any other child of a highly ranked person. Even the humans, with their government officials, guard those people and their children to where this would look like a dollhouse. That wasn't exactly true. This place had most of them beat, but I left that part out. How long have you worked here? I asked him, and he flinched again. Yeah, I was going to turn things around a bit. About a year. When you first started here, was it to spy on me and my dad? What? No, he stated, standing up quickly, and I heard a chair move behind the screen. I landed this job legitimately, he stated, and I smiled but shrugged. You hadn't shifted, he stated, quickly trying to make his own case. There was no reason for me to want anything more than an excellent job. Maybe you wanted to spy on me then, to find out about the daughter of the highest ranked vampire. Well, second highest. His eyes widened and I nodded. There's very little known about me on the outside of the top circles. Maybe you wanted to find out, feed the rumors, and send back information to the masses. I gasped. You might work for one of those underground papers, the ones that spread rumors and lies about our kind. His face tightened. Never, he shouted. I detest those things and the people that run them, even those that hunger for that filth. I stole a glance at the thick screen. Please don't come charging out, I thought. Well, Lucas, I don't know. You've lied and snuck around here spying and sending information without any facts back to those. How does that make you any better? He shook his head hard. No, it's nothing like that, he paced. When you started to shift, this place went into complete lockdown. The outside world was cut off. Only a handful of staff was allowed out when you were up. We had to work strange shifts and would be quickly pulled out for no reason, or none that we were told. Someone, a maid I think, said something about blood. Some of us got worried. When we tried to ask questions, we were reprimanded and forced to work in places you wouldn't be seen. I nodded. So, instead of seeing that what you were doing was wrong, you found a heroic angle to spying and ro- you found a heroic angle to the spying and rumor milling to make it seem noble? But it was. We we thought you were held here. And that what, Lucas? That my daddy had changed from a very loving, very wonderful father into a monster that was dissecting his daughter in secret rooms with the help of dozens of vampires and werewolves that had always cared about me? He stopped pacing and looked down at his hands. Bingo. I had done it. Then I drew in a slow breath and walked over to him, putting a hand on his shoulder. I do appreciate the rescue attempt and the loyalty, if it really was sincerely meant. It really was, he pleaded. I nodded. Then it seems I just made some new friends and allies without even knowing it. I'm glad it wasn't needed, but the fact that you were all willing to go up against everyone to save me, well, it's flattering. I smiled and he shrugged and grinned. Do you have any professional security training? No. Too bad. We might have been able to find a use for you in that area. I am impressed. You got a note in my pocket and have been getting messages out without being found out. Not an easy task here. He puffed out his chest a little. Wow, he was easy. Lucas, I do appreciate what you and your friends have went through for me. But we were about as wrong as we could possibly be, he stated in a defeated and embarrassed tone. I nodded. I'm afraid so. He nodded too. Well, I'm glad I was wrong. I feel stupid for it, but I'm glad. I chuckled. How about this? How about I talk to my dad and see if you can maybe work with our security in a different way? Really? How? I could feel Jonathan on the other side of the screen glaring through it. Well, you have connections out there. We need to know about the rumors. We need to know what they're saying and possibly getting ready to do. If you and your friends could do that, safely of course, I don't want any of you getting hurt, but just keep your eyes and ears open and report back to someone here. After all the trouble I've caused? I kind of like troublemakers, I chuckled. At least ones that do it for a good cause. He was smiling now. I'd like that. Jonathan stepped out from behind the screen, and Lucas tensed just a little. I turned. Jonathan, do you think you could arrange a chain of information between Lucas and the manor? Jonathan nodded, stepping up next to me. I can, and I also would offer my gratitude for your help, Lucas. I grinned. He was going to play the good cop along with me. Lucas's eyes simply could not get any bigger. Um, sure, he stammered, and we all walked towards the door that was opening. My dad and Michael were the only ones that walked in. I explained to my dad how Lucas was willing to keep an ear on what was going on outside the manor. I knew that my dad had many more capable people, well trained in this sort of thing, doing the very same thing. But my dad nodded and looked at Lucas. Can you do that for us? Lucas's head bobbed up and down fast. Yes, sir, I can. I mean, me and my friends can. He looked at me. We'll do our best to keep you safe. I'm very sorry we were wrong about the direction of the threat. I winked at him. I'm glad to know that you'll be out there helping. He smiled. His chest puffed out a bit, and my dad turned to him. Well, Lucas, seems you'll need to trade in your maintenance gear for some spyware, he chuckled. My men will help set you up with the latest gadgets. We'll also get you some phones that can be traced, and you'll be given a number directly to the head of the manor's security. Yes, sir, we won't let you down, Mr. Beldrin, Reina, he stated, nodding to me. I walked up and gave him a hug, which caught him off guard. I felt Jonathan stiffen, but he kept his composure. Remember, no doing anything to get yourselves hurt. You listen to what the guys teach you. I want all of you to be safe. No dangerous heroics out there. I couldn't stand that. I lowered my voice and my eyes at the end. We'll be very careful, I promise, he stated, his voice heavy and serious. I smiled at him, and then one of my dad's guards let him out. I waited until the hidden wall shut, and then I let out my breath. My dad chuckled and then threw back his head and laughed. Okay, it wasn't actually the response I was looking for. Reina, I need to have one of those Oscars made for you, he stated, and then I chuckled. That was absolute genius, he stated, stepping up and hugging me. Lucas will now be one very loyal, even though clumsy, spy. He shook his head. If I hadn't seen it and heard it... I rolled my eyes. So, can I get out of here now? I turned to Jonathan. I have a party to plan. Jonathan grinned and took my hand. We set a date, 2 weeks from today. That doesn't give us a lot of time. My dad's eyes widened. 2 weeks? I nodded. And we need to go over the guest list with you. Your sheltered daughter's side is rather slim, and I'm sure you have people you want to invite. He smiled. 2 weeks? Yes, Dad, 2 weeks. He turned around, looking at nothing in particular. 2 weeks? He glanced at Jonathan, who smiled and nodded. Okay, this was a bit weird. They were both way more excited about this party thing than I was. He walked out of the room, and I took a deep breath. The smell of freedom, sort of. The list, Jonathan yelped. He dragged me back into the room and picked up the pad of paper and the pen. It was cute that he hadn't let go of my hand, but I shook my head at him. He shrugged. Plans to make. Let's go. We followed my dad into one of the studies, and my dad sat at his computer. He and Jonathan went over my dad's list of who to invite. I frowned at one point and turned to them. Unless you two are planning on having this party somewhere else, I don't think everybody's going to fit in here. We had a large ballroom here, but from what I could gather, they were well past the 200 body limit that even it could hold. They stopped and looked at each other and then at me. I shrugged. The biggest room here could hold only 200 tops, I pointed out, and they frowned. 200, Jonathan said in a disappointed voice. When I nodded, he looked at my dad's computer screen. We're at 250 already. I chuckled and walked over to stand behind them. I glanced at the spreadsheet they were putting together. I recognized less than half the names on it. We could have it at Beamer's, Jonathan tried. Tops has more square footage, but it's broken down into 3 clubs, so everyone would be separated. Not a problem for me, but they seem to be forgetting something. I stood there and listened to them plot for a few minutes. There was a hall that very high vampires used. It could hold up to 1,000 or so, they were saying. Where did Allison and Joel have their party? Jonathan turned and looked up at me. At the Shores Club. That was a very nice vampire exclusive club, but the banquet room there could only handle about as much as our ballroom. They did open it up to other races as long as the event was vampire based. They turned back to the computer and quickly became reabsorbed in their spreadsheet and plans. I walked over and plopped down in a large, comfortable leather chair. I had one leg dangling over the arm, and I smiled as I glanced at the two of them. My boyfriend and my dad, so totally engrossed in plans for a party that they seemed to be forgetting 2 major things. One, the manor was on lockdown. Did they really expect that to change in 2 weeks? Number 2 was my shifting. Enough said on that subject. I guess there was a third because I couldn't figure out how poor Michael was going to get security together and do background checks on so many in such a short time. There was a knock on the door. I jumped up and trotted over to answer it. Michael was in the hallway, so I didn't feel bad for just opening it. Trax smiled at me. I thought you might like to take a swim, or something. I bit my lower lip and turned. Jonathan stood, but my dad was busy clicking away. Track looked at me and I shrugged. They're planning the party, I whispered, and he chuckled. Jonathan walked over and I smiled. Track asked if I wanted to go for a swim. Jonathan nodded. She could probably use the distraction. I'm afraid we're boring her with the party details. He smiled at me and I grinned. Track looked back towards the hall. Rock and Jackson are here. We could team up on them and have a little war to keep you occupied. My smile widened and Jonathan chuckled. How many girls would rather have a water war than plan their couples party? Track shrugged. Only one that I know of. They usually drool over that stuff. Jonathan nodded again. Well, I won't be hurt if you want to go. Your dad and I will get the list narrowed down, and then you and I can go over it. I bounced on my toes. Hooray! Freedom without guilt. I gave him a hard hug, a quick kiss, because to be honest, it was weird to do even that with Track right there. Then Track took my hand and we headed out. He's right, you know, Track teased as we walk. The female is usually out of her mind with stress and worry about getting everything just right. I shrugged. Not me. I'll let them take care of all that. They seem to enjoy it anyhow. Rock and Jonathan didn't... Rock and Jackson didn't stand a chance. Track and I creamed them. We blasted them with everything we had. Plus we knew where the bigger water guns were hidden. Okay, so maybe that was a little unfair, but it was a blast. Rock snuck up on me and grabbed me around the waist, then flung us both into the pool. I screamed as we splashed in and came up coughing but laughing. Track jumped in and pulled me up and away from Rock. No drowning my partner, man. That's cheating. We all laughed. Jackson did a cannonball near us and the water plumed upwards and crashed down on us. I shook my head. Weak. That was only a 6 at best. Suddenly, the room began to spin, and I moaned, putting my hands on the side of my head to try to stop it. Luckily, my feet touched the bottom of the pool. Track grabbed me and quickly pulled me to the stairs, sitting me down on the middle one. Shifting? He asked. No, I don't think so, I whispered. It's just my head. Everything is spinning. Is it from the dunk in the tub? Rock asked, though he wasn't laughing. I looked up, the room moving a little less. Maybe, I smiled weakly. The room finally steadied and I shrugged. It's gone now. You need to go see the doctor, Track said, his eyes tight. Oh God, please no more doctors, I moaned, standing up. I'm fine, really. And I was. The spinning was gone. I still think you should at least let them know. Whose side are you on? I chuckled, taking a step down into the pool. Rock nodded. Yeah, man, they have turned her into a guinea pig. Give her a break. Track turned. Really? And what if it's serious? Rock frowned and looked at me. I rolled my eyes. Oh, you girls are so paranoid. Rock blinked several times. Did she just call us girls? I chuckled and stepped further into the pool, but Rock turned, grabbed me, and threw me around his neck like a scarf. I yelped but laughed. Can a girl do this? He asked and stepped out of the pool. I could do it, I laughed, and he turned and eyed me. Really? When I nodded, he headed towards the deep end, and I yelped, Don't you dare! He dared. He walked to the edge and threw me in. I landed on my side and felt the pain of the water slap against me as I went in. When I hit the bottom, I went to push up with my feet, but they wouldn't respond. I frowned and tried again. My brain was telling my body what to do, but my body wasn't listening. I tried to move my arms. Nothing. I could move my head, though, and I looked up to see the large lights over the shimmering surface. Crap, I thought, then closed my eyes. Track, I can't move. Something's wrong, I thought, with the part that I used to communicate with him and Jonathan as a wolf. There was another splash, and I turned to see Track swimming towards me. He grabbed me under the arms and pushed up. I felt the water rushing around me. I felt my legs and arms, but they hung like wet blankets. When he pulled us out of the water, I drew in a long, loud breath. Rock and Jackson were there, and they walked next to Track as he scooped me up and carried me out. He was yelling to Michael to get the doctors. Then Rock was laying large towels on the ground. Track laid me on them and sat, leaning over me. Can you hear me? I nodded. It seemed one thing worked. Yes, I said, and then realized my lips didn't move. What was going on? I frowned and used my thoughts. Yes, I can, but nothing seems to work. His frown deepened and he looked up. I heard footsteps and tilted my chin to see Jonathan and my dad running over. Seems Jonathan heard me call out to Track. I wondered why they were the only two that could hear me this way, but was glad I didn't have to be in wolf form for it to work. They knelt next to me and Track quickly explained what happened. Did she hit her head? My dad asked, putting a hand under my head and feeling around. No, Track stated. She did get a little dizzy just a few minutes before. Jonathan shot him a look. I told him I was fine, I thought. He wanted to get a doctor then, and I told him no. Jonathan's jaw tightened and Track shook his head. This is what I get for listening to you. A mistake I won't make again. He gave me a small smile and then winked. More footsteps and clanking. Great. The doctors and their tools of torture. They knelt down next to me and Track again explained what had happened. The older one checked the back of my head and then felt around my scalp. I didn't hit my head, I shouted in my mind. Then they listened to my heart and lungs and then felt along my arms and legs. I could feel their hands and nodded when they asked if I could. The older one shook his head. We need to get her dry and into the lab where we could check her out better. Run more experiments, I hissed, and then my eyes widened as I realized I said it out loud. Everyone stopped and I sighed. Then I lifted my right arm slowly. It felt very heavy, but it moved. Let's get her into the lab, the doctor repeated, and Jonathan and Track both reached for me. Track gave a very quiet growl and moved back. Jonathan slid his arms under me and stood. My dad covered me with a large towel and we moved to the lab. A maid and Paige came in, the maid with a stack of my clothes. Paige turned. "You guys turn around until we have her dressed." They reluctantly listened, and I was able to help them dry me off and put my clothes on. I smiled at Paige, and she smiled back, but the worry was plain on her face. When she finally announced I was decent, the others turned, and the doctors looked at my dad. "We will need to run some tests, an x-ray, and a CAT scan, some blood work." My dad nodded, and the doctor glanced towards the door. "We are not going anywhere," he told them, and the doctor gave a grunted response. The test came back normal. Well, normal for me. My blood work was never anything completely normal, but they couldn't find any reason for my temporary paralysis. All my body parts were working fine now, and I was getting a little more than irritated. "Can I go back to my own room?" I snapped. This place was too sterile and creepy. "Of course you can, sweetheart," my dad said, and the doctor frowned. They wanted me to stay here a while longer. "You can do whatever you need to do in her room," he stated, and looked at Jonathan, who nodded. I stood up, and everyone watched me. I rolled my eyes and took a few steps, hoping my legs wouldn't make a fool out of me. They held. I walked to my room, Jonathan on one side, Dad on the other, and tracked behind me. When I got to my room, I was energized, and the last thing I wanted to do was lay down. "Can't I just go for a walk?" I moaned. I ended up in the bed, grumpy, a little whining, but they had flat out refused. Rock and Jackson finally left, and Paige kept quiet in a chair at the other end of the room. She smiled at me when I looked at her, but she stayed where she was. And that's where I'm going to end this one.